Hello podcasters, welcome to another episode of Living History. I hope you're enjoying all the content we're putting out in the lead up to Anzac Day. Anzac Day is only a few days away. It's going to be a really special one, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, the big focus on the Western Front. I'm really excited about it. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm over here in France at the moment and I'll be bringing you coverage of Anzac Day as it happens from Villers-Bretonneux. Today's podcast, we're going to be talking to Peter Greste. And Peter is someone that you'll remember because of his imprisonment in Egypt. He's a journalist who was locked up on false terrorism charges. It was a huge international story, and thankfully he made it out and he's back in Australia now. But he's just made a fantastic new documentary, which I was lucky enough to work on him with. The documentary is about John Monash, and it's called Monash and Me. And it really tells the story of John Monash in a very new and interesting way. I really enjoyed working on this doco with Peter, and I think you'll enjoy watching it as well. So it's coming up on the ABC this week, so certainly look out for it because it does tell the Monash story in a very new and interesting way. And Monash is a bit of a mixed bag. We don't know enough about Monash, and the things we know I don't think we take in the right way. So I think this documentary will have a really important role in telling that story of John Monash. So look out for it. It's on the ABC this week in the lead up to Anzac Day. I think the 24th of April it's screening on the ABC. Look out for it. And now here's Peter Greste talking about the documentary Monash and Me.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest ever.
Peter, it's great to speak to you. It was great to work with you on the documentary, and it's a bit of a different approach, I think, to this story. Why don't we start by you telling us, just give us your summation of the documentary and the story it's trying to tell.
Well, obviously it's a look at Sir John Monash and his life, but through my own eyes. One of the problems is that a lot of the historical documentaries, the traditional way of doing a historical doc is to have a presenter who acts as the kind of voice of God going around talking to all sorts of fusty historians. But what we wanted to do was to really take some of my own personal experience on front lines in more modern conflicts and look at what Monash did and his experiences through that lens, but also try to see my own connections to Monash and his story. And it turns out that I've got quite a few relatives who served under him in the First World War, and so coming to understand that relationship has been very much a part of the story, but also was the thing that really made it so exciting for me.
Do you feel that those personal experiences you touched on, I mean, people would know your story about being imprisoned in Egypt and the whole huge dramas that went with that whole chapter of your life. Does that experience influence how you tell these stories and your perception of what these people went through and these chapters of history?
Oh, of course. It can't not inform it. I mean, the experience of Egypt was a very particular experience, and that in itself might not have fed directly into the storytelling around Monash. But my experiences on front lines as a foreign correspondent, my work and seeing commanders direct troops, the times that I've spent watching the soldiers themselves in frontline operations, all of that has to inform the way that you think about and understand the actions of a man who was right in the middle of those conflicts exactly 100 years ago.
How did you approach the documentary? Did you know a lot about Monash before you started filming, or was this all a bit of a new discovery for you as well?
No, it was all very new. I think, like so many Australians, I think Monash, in a lot of respects, was a bit of an abstraction. He was this kind of two-dimensional war hero, this commander that I knew very little about, except the fact that he served in the First World War, that he was pretty good at his job, and then he gave his name to a university and a highway. But beyond that, he was a bit of a mystery to me, and so it was an incredible privilege to be able to really get into the film and understand so much more about what Monash did and the way that he shaped Australia.
So you mentioned you had this personal connection through your family. Was it a great journey of discovery, finding out about these men who had served in the First World War?
it was an incredible journey of discovery. And I think, again, in so many ways, because I've spent time on front lines and because I've seen what soldiers do and how they cope with those kinds of conflicts, with battles and with war generally, I was able to identify and think about and see and understand what they went through at a much more visceral level than I honestly ever really expected. I felt far more connected to them than I ever really imagined that I would at the start of the project. It was really quite an extraordinary experience, but it was also quite humbling to see the sacrifice that my uncles and the family gave in the First World War. Now, I'm sure that our family's experience was pretty typical, which in a way also makes it even more confronting, because you realize that our experience was multiplied so many times over in families right across Australia and around the world. But, we sent 4 boys off to war. 2 of them were killed in battle, and 2 of them were terribly, terribly wounded. And that's a pretty heavy price to pay.
Do you feel now a stronger connection to these men that you didn't have before you told their stories? I mean, the reason I ask this question is most Australian families have a connection, a great uncle or an uncle who went off and fought and died in the war. We grew up hearing these stories from our grandparents, but it's very two-dimensional. It doesn't mean very much, but I found that walking the ground, seeing the headstones makes a huge difference. Did you find that when you were there in France?
Yeah, absolutely. And more than that, I mean, walking the ground, seeing the battlefields, discovering their graves, seeing their headstones, but also reading their diaries, reading the letters and the accounts of their units, their unit diaries, their unit records. All of those things made it far, far more visceral, far more real, and far more personal than I ever really expected. And as I said, that's even on top of my own understanding of what they would have gone through as a reporter.
What was the most emotional part of telling this story of your family's experience in the war?
Oh, gosh. I think at the very end, that discovering what my great uncle Ernest had gone through. He survived the war, but he was gassed on the lines, and my other uncle Henry said he was slightly gassed, which, given what we know from the medical records, was something of an understatement. He came back to Australia as a broken man, both physically and I also suspect emotionally. He was clearly suffering enormously, and to see the way that he was suffering, to go through his medical records and to understand what it was that he was dealing with was in itself pretty confronting. But also to see the way that the Australian government, and I suspect, well, certainly my own family, and I suspect a lot of Australian society, largely sort of sidelined him, tried to forget about him, didn't really understand him or what he'd been through and what he was continuing to struggle with. All of that was incredibly emotional and very difficult to take.
I can certainly imagine that. And we know as well from telling this story and from the things we've read that Monash was a man who was particularly interested in the welfare of these men after they came back from the war. So let's talk about Monash. I mean, what was revealed to you in telling this story that you didn't know and that most Australians wouldn't know about him?
Oh, look, Monash is such an interesting character, isn't he? I mean, he's as I said earlier, we've tended to flatten him out, as we so often do with historical figures, into two-dimensional characters. We all know Monash as the engineer and the general who took an engineer's brain to organising his troops. But Monash comes across as someone who was insecure, who was creative, who was desperate for recognition, for acknowledgement from his peers and his superiors. He was a guy who was intensely interested in the arts and theatre. He was a guy who was incredibly, we think of him as quite cold-hearted and calculating and quite dry, but he was also quite clearly incredibly passionate in his relationships with women in his life. So, the more you understand him, the more read his diaries, the more you follow in his footsteps, certainly the more I felt that he was a character who was both admirable. It was very human in his flaws and his failings. He was incredibly admirable in what he was able to achieve. But I also imagine, I don't know about you, but he strikes me as the kind of bloke that would have been a right royal pain in the backside to live with. I mean, he was so obsessively concerned with detail that while it's a sort of useful thing to have in a military officer and a commander and a general who is organizing extraordinarily big and complex military campaigns, I think that obsession with detail would have driven me certainly round the bend.
It's funny you say that, because I do get that from Monash. I do find that a lot that you read about him doesn't make you think he's a bloke you want to sit down and have dinner with. I mean, he's a very complicated character, very set in his ways. I mean, he was a man of his time, of course. That's one thing that we have to look back. Do you think, as Australians, particularly outside of Victoria, we remember Monash in the right way?
No, I don't think we do. I think we have been too shallow in our understanding of him. And I think that's partly because we've lost sight of the role that he played. You know, Monash was a victim of history and politics. He was largely written out of the British narrative of the war because he was a colonial, I think, and most of the credit had to go to British officers. And he was sidelined by Australian politicians, by Billy Hughes in particular, because he saw him as a political threat, and that was justified or not. And that means that he doesn't really occupy the kind of place that I think he really deserves, because Monash, however, for better or for worse, Monash, I think, really shaped the DNA of the Australian military, but also was so instrumental in designing and shaping Anzac Day, which is the way that we really define ourselves. And for a bloke who was so central to such important parts of our history and our understanding of who we are, for us to have so little understanding of them, I think is quite tragic.
Well, he's fallen through the cracks in a number of ways, hasn't he? Because we've got, a huge amount of written work from him, but written work obviously requires the reader to go out and source it and find it and engage with it. But there's no that we know of recording of even his voice. We don't even know what his voice sounded like. There's some very grainy, limited moving footage of him. But he for someone who left such an imprint on Australia, it feels to me like he should have done more. There should be more of him. We should know him more. He should appear in more places. Do you have that feeling about Monash?
Oh, yeah, very much so. He should definitely be out there more. And we should have a relationship with him, more of a relationship with him than we do. And this is what I'm saying. I think we need to know him better. We need to understand him better. We need to not celebrate him in the sense of necessarily putting him up on a pedestal and idolizing him. I'm personally very wary of setting people up as idols. But I think that he's not someone who we really know or understand or recognize. And I think that's, as I said before, I think that's really sad.
You've walked these battlefields where he achieved some of his greatest victories. And as we've been discussing, there's really two sides to John Monash. There's the one where we don't really know him well enough, and we probably as Australians should know him more. But then there's the other side. There's the people who do know him, and the people who do know his story. Many of them portray him as this incredible military genius who effectively won the First World War on his own. Where do you stand on that now, having walked in his footsteps, having stood in his chateau in France, having been on these battlefields? Where do you now stand on Monash's place in history?
I don't think he single-handedly won the First World War. I think that, I think there are a few people who perhaps overstate his significance, who would like him to give him a place in history right alongside the likes of Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte and Julius Caesar for military commanders. I think it's a mistake always. As a journalist, as someone who's seen these guys operate up close, I'm always wary of giving too much credit, of turning people into idols. And I don't think Monash himself would have perhaps welcomed the idea of being idolized. and credited with winning the war single-handedly. I think that's a rather gross overstatement. But equally, I think he has, in large parts of history, he hasn't got anywhere near the credit that's due. There's no doubt that Monash was a product of his time, and that part of that time was the emerging technologies. And I suspect whether Monash had come up with some of the strategies or not, at some point someone would have put them together in the way that Monash ultimately did. But that isn't to take away from the fact that he was incredibly important in developing the kinds of military thinking, the military doctrines, the military strategies that came to define much of warfare through the rest of the 20th century and still shapes the way that we think about war today. And for that, I think we really don't give him enough credit.
It's interesting you mentioned that what Monash would have thought himself about various things. It's this current controversy that's going on at the moment with this this group that have named themselves after Monash, and I've heard it's been the most extraordinary discussion where people have been saying it's inappropriate or it's completely appropriate or this is what Monash would have wanted. Where do you stand on all this stuff? 100 years down the track, where do you stand on this appropriation of his name for these purposes?
I'm going to stick my neck out here and say what I feel quite strongly, and that is that I think what I know of Monash, from what I've seen with his writing, I can't help but feel that he would have rejected the ideas that the Monash group have claimed to appropriate. It's true that Monash was the guy who was responsible for electrifying Victoria and doing it mostly through developing brown coal and brown coal technologies in the Latrobe Valley. But as Monash's own family have pointed out in one of their letters, Monash was using cutting-edge technology that was the very latest that was out there, and that was typical of everything that Monash was doing as an engineer, as an officer. He was always interested in the very latest developments, and I think he would have been absolutely opposed to the idea of using technology that was developed at the turn of the last century and seeing it as the solution to our current problems. But having said that, I'm also slightly wary about assuming to speak for Monash. As you suggested, I think it's perhaps a little bit of hubris.
Well, you got to know him very well, and that's the thing that I'm fascinated about. I spent a lot of time with you when we were making this documentary, Walking the Ground, and I know you spent a lot of time in the archives, and you spent time in his chateau at Batong, where he commanded the Australians. Do you feel you got to know him better in the archives by reading his words, or by being out in the field, walking the ground where the battles had occurred and being in his headquarters in France?
Gosh, that's an impossible question to answer, really. It's not a binary thing, I don't think. I think, in both ways you start to understand him differently. By going through the archives and actually seeing and handling his papers, his own papers, the papers that he wrote, the letters that he wrote himself is also an interesting experience. There are places in his own diaries where he talks about, as a young 16-year-old kid, he talks about his sense of destiny, his sense of purpose. And he does it, and the writing is very direct. There's no crossing out. There's no equivocation. There doesn't appear to be any hesitation in the writing. It seems to be very flowing prose. It seems to be very assured, very self-assured. And to see that, I think is really quite enlightening. You get a really potent sense of the guy. But equally, you can't. It's important to walk those battlefields, to retrace not just the physical steps, but the mental steps that he went through and the development of his own thinking. You couldn't wind up. One of the things I've learned is that history is very much a process. It's not an event. And Monash clearly arrived at some points, made some of the decisions, the key decisions that he made, because of his own history. He had a very difficult start in Gallipoli. He was involved in some pretty disastrous campaigns in the early stages of the Western Front battles. And I think, when you see that, when you walk in his shoes, when you start to understand the costs that he saw his men paying, when you start to see how it all and how his military doctrine started to unfold, then you also start to get a measure of the guy.
How do you think we'll remember him in years to come? Do you think that this documentary will obviously play a part in that? But how, as Australians, in the coming years, how do you think we'll look back on Monash?
That's a really good question. I think inevitably, particularly as we go through another round of revision around this 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, I would hope that we take a much more nuanced view of the guy. I would hope that we start to see him as the character and the human that he really was, and appreciate him for all of the character flaws that he had. I ultimately, even though I said I might not have enjoyed living with him, I still would love to have met him. I would still love to sit down with him over a dinner. I would still love to spend time with the guy because I think he is an extraordinary Australian.
Well, Peter, it's been really wonderful getting your insights into Monash. What are you working on next? What's coming up in the future that we'll see from Peter Greste?
Got to work a lot of that out at the moment, Matt. I'm still busy, but at the moment I'm working for the University of Queensland as a professor of journalism. My formal, rather pompous title is UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication. And it's a fantastic job. It's not only involved in helping shape the next generation of journalists and passing on some of my own experience, but also involved very much in research and advocacy around press freedom issues, which are things that have been concerning me an awful lot. But also on top of that, I'm still able, thankfully, to do the kinds of work that I've always been doing that I love so much, and that's more of these kinds of journalism projects, and that's a really exciting thing.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I'm really excited about this documentary. I'm looking forward to seeing it. It really does tell the Monash story in a new way. The documentary is called Monash and Me, Peter Greste and Australia's Greatest Commander, and it is screening on the ABC on April 24. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for talking to me, Matt. Great to catch up.